Welcome everyone. So today what we're going to do is that we're going to be talking a lot about transaction monitoring and also how that is enabled quite significantly by having trusted data sources. We're going to also have Brett talk a lot about World Check data as a way of powering transaction monitoring, and how we integrate and create value from you by integrating the two platforms. In addition to that, we'll be kind of walking through transaction monitoring and showing how it is a way of fueling all the other areas of your AML compliance program and how that works. But as in all situations, you do realize that there's a practicality to actually getting transaction monitoring to work effectively in your organization. So we're going to put a little bit of a reality twist to it and show you some of the challenges that you're likely to have with data and how you can overcome those challenges. So once I go through that, then Brett will go through his part talking a lot about the data, and then at the end we'll show how we bring everything back together and how you can use visualizations and so on to create amazing insights to drive changes that you need to be making to your transaction monitoring program. So what is transaction monitoring in the context of AML? This is a very basic definition, but what you're looking at is it's an approach where you can be examining transactions that are going through your financial institution and look for potential indicators of money laundering and terrorist financing, primarily by looking for what we call unusual or suspicious activities. In a broader context, you can look at transaction monitoring, not so much as just looking at transactions, but also looking at activities. And that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about later on, that shows how looking at the activities of your customers, you can also create amazing insights about the risks and exposures related to them. The purpose for most persons that implement transaction monitoring in an AML context is that you're looking for suspicious activities that you're required to report to the regulators. And there are a number of new regulations that have come out that speak specifically to transaction monitoring and making it more and more a mandatory requirement. Another thing too is that if you implement transaction monitoring in a really solid way, then you should be able to use that to inform the risks that you're facing in terms of your customers, and I think I mentioned that before. And also what you're looking at is using that to try to understand what is the normal behavior or what is the consistent behavior of a customer, their transactions, and also looking at transactions of their peers and recognizing that there might be an anomaly right there. So if you think about transaction monitoring at the center of everything that you're doing, you'll see that when you look at customer due diligence, whether it is that you're doing sanctions screening, or you're looking for PEPs, or you're doing negative news or anything like that, some persons might also be doing things like ID verification and risk profiling. When you're doing that customer due diligence process, one of the things that you'll find is that transaction monitoring can really help to fuel that as well. The transaction monitoring also is going to be the fuel for, or the inputs into, a lot of your regulatory reporting. In most instances, your CTRs could almost be automated 100% if you have really good transaction monitoring. Your SARs, that's a little bit more involved, and so but you can have a high percentage of your SARs being auto-completed and auto-filed if you have a really strong transaction monitoring process. Another thing that you'll find is that sometimes when you implement transaction monitoring, persons will say, well, I get an alert or I'm being overrun by alerts. How do you manage that? And that is one of the things that you have to pay attention to. For example, if there is a particular transaction and it triggers 4 different alerts based on different scenarios that you're testing, the question is, do I investigate 4 different alerts, or do I just look at that one transaction? And that's one of the things that case management should allow you to do, is that you should be able to aggregate all the insights about a transaction, about an entity, whether it's a customer or another business, or even an employee, and how you bring all of those insights together and investigate all of those alerts as one issue or one case. Workflow management and those things, the transaction monitoring also fuels into that, giving you data so that the workflow automation can make decisions and decide how to route items and how to respond to them and how to even automate a lot of the activities that you would do in your investigation. So again, at the centerpiece of most of your AML technologies is you should have transaction monitoring. That's driving a lot of what is going on here. This next slide that I have is more intended, if I could just get it to move on a little bit. The next slide I have is more intended for just documentation to kind of talk about what I said a while ago. But you can, if you're looking at transaction monitoring models for implementation, this is an example of one of them that should probably work pretty well. There are many different ways that you can configure transaction monitoring. Some of you are very familiar with the whole concept of creating rules. So you'll have different rules about different products, about different type of scenarios that you want to test, and you want to examine the transactions to see if it triggers those type of activities. So for example, if you're an MSB, it might be, hey, do I have transfers that are going to a high risk destination over a certain amount of money? That's a very simple rule. Most of you would have also been looking at things like anomaly detection. So you might be looking at implementing machine learning or artificial intelligence. And if that is the case, then you can also layer those models on top of the scenarios as well. And I think in the future, you'll find that these models, in terms of using ML or AI, they will probably be the bulk of what you're doing for transaction monitoring. And so when you get this actual presentation, there's a blog that I did maybe 6 months ago, I think, and it talks about rules-based and advanced analytics, and you don't really have to choose. You can kind of layer your transaction monitoring program with both sets of technologies. Beyond that, one of the things is not all alerts that comes from your system are going to be equal. So what you want to do is that you want to have some sort of a scoring process or a scoring engine that says, hey, by the way, here's a particular transaction. It involves someone that's potentially involved in terrorist financing. That's very different from, hey, here's an alert. There's an issue with this person identification. That's 2 different things. So how do you score it? How do you prioritize it? There's something else that a lot of transaction monitoring implementations are doing that you might want to consider, and that is you can actually layer the customer and activity risk scoring on top of the transaction monitoring process. What that means is, if Andrew Simpson is a very low risk person, as I would be, right? And then you have Christine, who is a very high risk person. And I know she's not happy with that, but I don't have anyone else to pick on. And I have to make sure that you don't start thinking negatively of Brett before he presents, right? So Christine is a really high risk person. And let's say that both of us are involved in some level of structuring or layering or something like that. So who should you look at first? You can looking at the risk level of the customer and then using that to prioritize. In terms of the different actions, years ago, most persons implemented transaction monitoring after the fact. But today, a lot of transaction monitoring systems, especially things like looking at payment transactions or wire transfers, those are all being done in real time. And so the different actions that you can take varies based on the risk level. So you can decide if you want to block a transaction, if you want to route it for investigation, or if you want to just log it and say there's a potential issue, but the risk level is not sufficiently high for me to do more than just continue to monitor it. So those are some of the different approaches that you can take, and not all continuous monitoring models look the same, but this is one potential model that you can consider. Okay. A good transaction monitoring model, I would think, what it does is that it looks at detecting money laundering activities early, not long after the fact, and you're just going ahead and reporting. A really solid model looks at how can we get early detection into play, how can we look at symptoms of things that could be a big problem for you later, allow you to score and prioritize the work. So in terms of your workflow automation and your case management, you can look at the highest risk items first. What it also does is that it looks at the risk around a particular entity. And there's something else that you'll find too, is that in compliance, if it is that you are doing all the investigations, there's a lot of blind, there's a lot that you don't know about the customers, about their specific activities. And so a good transaction monitoring system also looks at engaging your first line of defense and pushing items as far out into your organization as possible. So when the items get escalated into your compliance department, it comes with a lot of insights from the branches, from the remote locations, from the persons that are handling and managing the accounts. The other thing too is that your transaction monitoring model should really start getting feedback coming from the investigations to manage false positives as well. So that's a really good, a solid model. If you look at implementing something, you should be considering these factors. Now, all of you would be saying, okay, well, I'm in an MSB, I'm in a bank, I'm in a casino, or I'm in the retail business. How do I figure out what I should be monitoring? There's a really good research document by Protivity that a lot of people tend to use from time to time, and it gets updated every year. So there's a link here for you to take a look at it. So if you want to look at things that you should be looking at for, like even ATMs, even wire transfers and so on, and virtual currencies and all of that, there are some really good red flags here that you should look at considering it. Some of them are a little bit basic, but it's a good starting point in terms of looking at your rules or your different scenarios that you should be implementing. Also be reminded that beyond that, though, you should also be considering using some level of machine learning or AI to kind of, at a minimum, look at some sort of anomaly detection in your transaction monitoring models, right? One of the things that we wanted to talk a little bit about here too in terms of risk scoring is that many times the risk scoring models that tend to get implemented is very static. So it looks at the customer profile, but then based on their activity, nothing is getting updated. So one of the things that you can be looking at is how can transaction monitoring really push into me getting some insights around my activity risk. So that's the person that you have onboarded, everything is good with them, everything looks perfect, but then the type of business that they start conducting in terms of transactions should be increasing their risk levels. So you should be looking at those activities that way, and that's what transaction monitoring is actually going to be helping you to do. Beyond that too, is that a lot of us look at relationships and assess the risk of relationships that way. So let's say that Christine was very high risk, I was very low risk. So initially when you're onboarding me, everything was okay. But then a lot of my activity is with Christine, and Christine is a very high risk customer. Then if that's the case, should I also inherit some of that implied risk because of the relationship that I potentially, or the link that I potentially have with Christine? Those insights can only come through doing really good transaction monitoring. So this is just talking about another way in terms of looking at the relationship and how you model it. And there are lots of tools out there that helps you to bring this to to life and figuring out how you're going to do that. But again, many persons are doing this just based on addresses and household and family links and so on, but they're not necessarily looking at the actual activities and the data that is coming in and how you do that. The other thing that transaction monitoring helps to fuel is how you do your regulatory reporting. Probably, I would say, if I were to ask everyone that's on the call, it is, well, what do you hate doing the most? You're going to say, I hate filling out SARs, I hate doing the regulatory reporting because it's tedious, takes a lot of work, there are tons and tons of fields. And if you have a really good transaction monitoring platform, it should be helping you to pre-fill and in some instances even auto-file the regulatory reporting to FinCEN, right? Or any other regulator that you're involved in. And this is a big, big bonus if you can get this automation done for you. And in fact, you know, we have a simple case study here that's on the screen, and you'll get it when you download the presentation. We had a customer that they were an MSB, of course, and these are guys that are overrun all the time with regulatory reporting. They had 4 full-time persons doing the regulatory reports, and after they implement a solid transaction monitoring platform, it was reduced to 1.4 persons. And not just that, but in addition to that, they also had a 50% increase in terms of the SARs that they were able to detect and file. Because they were not just like head down overrun by filing reg reports, they were actually now starting to look at alerts that are coming back from the transaction monitoring system. Now, all of you would say, well, Andrew, that's all great, but reality check here. I have 14 different systems that I need to get data from. I have 10 different ways that I can recognize that Andrew Simpson is a customer. How do I manage all of that? How do I keep that going? And this, I think, is one of the tough parts of transaction monitoring in terms of trying to make sure that you have real good, solid insights around where your data is coming from and how do you aggregate and bring it together intelligently. It's very important that if you are in, say, if you're in a business and there are 3 different systems that has a customer record for Andrew Simpson, then you need to make sure that when you're aggregating all of that and bringing it into the transaction monitoring system, there is a way for you to have that single view of the customer. Otherwise, you're going to be handling more alerts and more situations and cases than you need to. So it's very important that you get that full view of that customer risk across the platforms. One of the things that we have seen customers do very well and made a big impact for them is that they have looked at ways to enrich the data that they have. How can you enrich that data? Like, for example, if you're involved, if you're in a banking situation or any other financial institution, and your customers, they are doing a lot of online work with you in terms of online transactions. What you can also do is that you can look at the IP addresses and take the IP addresses and enrich it in terms of knowing where exactly they're doing the transactions from. So you might have a customer that says, hey, I'm residing in the United States, but then, hey, every time that they're doing a transaction, it originates with an IP address that's in North Korea. You know, you can take a look at that. There's country risk ranking as well, and some of you might be using like the corruption index to rank countries. Maybe not the best source. It's okay, but it's not that great, because depending on what it is that you're monitoring for, then you'll find that the corruption index, the corruption score might be low, but then the risk of human trafficking or the risk of elder abuse might be very high. So it depends on what it is that you're looking for. You might want to risk rank the countries differently. Of course, enhancing the data with WorldCheck, enhancing with WorldCheck data is also very important, because then it brings insights and intelligence that the customer may not necessarily have presented to you. So that's another way to enhance what you're doing in terms of customer due diligence. So what I wanted to do is to talk about just one last major challenge here in terms of data and how you're going to overcome it. So a big challenge, right? Everywhere that we try to look at implementing transaction monitoring, there's always a data challenge. Data does not exist. You don't have the information. You don't have updated addresses. You may not have updated identification. So there's always these KYC challenges. Then in terms of the transactions themselves, you might be having transactions across multiple systems. And so when you're pulling and aggregating the intelligence, the data to make it intelligent, you have to also look at making sure that it is complete. Validity as well. So if you're an MSB, for example, or you might be in the crypto space, well, they're classifying you the same way, but you might also be finding that there are instances where the data that you're getting is really quite inaccurate and incomplete. So you have to find ways of recognizing that there's going to be challenges with the data, and how do you handle that? The main thing I'd like to bring across is that there are ways to deal with that. So for example, if you look in your database and you see 3 different addresses, as I've outlined here, 234 Leader Avenue without the E, Leader Street still in Denver, and you look at all the different pieces, when you break them out and parse out the data, you can actually go through and start standardizing the data. And you can that way you can create what we call a best of breed record. A best of breed record just means that you have looked at all the data that is out there, you have taken the best pieces of all of it and create a really strong, high quality record. And for companies out there that have many instances of a customer record, this is very important in terms of a strategy for you to pursue. Then you also have situations where you may have to, for the AML platform to work very well, it needs some consistent representation of the customer. And in those instances, what you need is to create something that we call a virtual customer ID. A virtual customer ID means that it's a unique way of identifying Brad Jones across 3 different systems as being the same person. So if those three customer records are conducting transactions across the financial institutions in a number of different ways, you need to be able to aggregate all of those and recognize that it is the same customer, especially when you're completing your SARs and filing your SARs. So those are some of the challenges that you'll have. This is kind of like a good way to go about implementing transaction monitoring. What I'm going to do is I'm going to transfer over to Brett. He's going to go through data and how that data itself enriches the experience and the value. And then Brett and I will kind of wrap up in the end by bringing it all together and show how we make it very insightful. Brett?
Hey, thanks, Andrew. Nice to meet you, everybody. Thanks for having me. Andrew spoke a lot about the transaction monitoring framework. I want to speak a little bit about the content, the data, really highlight what we're seeing with clients who are leveraging this technology to build that process, build that risk-based approach, and feel free to throw your questions to Christine in the chat box there, and we'll leave time at the end for sort of that discussion. Thomson Reuters recently completed some market data research as it relates to the data, showing where that focus area is, and really what we found, which I'll slide to shortly, is whether you're part of an MSB or a sell side, buy side, Schedule I, II bank, even our non-financial clients are doing this. Non-FinCEN regulated entities are starting to do this, and it was uniform. Whether it was across the board, whether it was a transaction monitoring use case, a risk profiling use case, a screening use case, the majority of their time was spent in PEP management and PEP disclosure in and around a risk-based approach. We joked that Christine was high risk, and I think that's going to be a running gag now moving forward. But the challenge really comes into play when you onboard a John Smith or a Lee, or a given common name, or perhaps an Andrew Simpson as a relatively common name. How do we manage this from a content perspective, especially when it comes to this PEP exposure, because there's just so much political exposure. I don't want to jump into the definition today. I think everybody here knows, by and large, what a PEP is. But really, if nothing else, wanted to highlight why it's important here. What we're seeing more and more is an increased instance of financial fraud, an increased instance of bribery, increased instance of corruption, access to public funds. More and more over the past 3 to 5 years, it's not just gone from the media, it's now in those sort of FinCEN, OFAC, FINRA, even SEC conversations where clients are coming forward and they've got sanctions monitoring or some risk ranking. And then the question from the regulators is, well, how are we managing PEPs? The first thing you want to do in that process, if that's something that you're factoring in to these risk-based approaches, is understanding what kind of PEP you're dealing with, pardon me. So there's foreign PEP legislation, there's domestic PEP legislation, there's associates, state-owned entity, state-invested entity, close associates, affiliates, quote, what's an associate? Understanding the definition of a PEP up front is key. I would advocate that you connect internally with stakeholders in the business, whether it's counsel or chief compliance officers, et cetera, members of those teams. Connect externally. I always advocate for transparency with your regulator or perhaps third-party counsel, and just define it. Start by saying, well, what jurisdictions are we in? What are those independent jurisdictional definitions of political exposure, state-owned entity, state-invested entity, and so on, and derivatives from there. That'll help you start to document what sort of risk-based approach you want to take in each portion of your business to allow for that efficient transaction monitoring. As you consolidate systems, create automation, create iterant improvement in workflow design, it's important to have sort of those benchmark rules set up. And to have those rules, what we need is sort of those definitions. I was chatting with Andrew recently. It's interesting, in Canada, just to the north, in 2017, there was a whole change in how and what they do from a PEP definition perspective. Completely overhauled the entire money laundering landscape. In Latin America, just on the back of the World Cup, actually, certain soccer players and movie stars, believe it or not, are considered popularly exposed. So they fall into the PEP categorization. In India, as an example, people who run for office are considered PEPs, never mind get elected. So what happens every year in India, there's these civil elections, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people are added to the PEP workflow, and then they need to be removed. So, and again, not to say that everybody would work in those jurisdictions, but if there's facets of your business that are global or facets of your business that are higher risk or work with people who are higher risk, it's very important to have those definitions, I would say, down pat. And again, bringing it back to the why, because that's really what we're doing here, is helping organizations manage that risk-based approach, protect the profit model. What we don't want is front page news, whether it's the Financial Times or the Wall Street Journal. Over the past, I think it's 20 years or 10 years, here it is, 25 years, pardon me, 20 billion to 40 billion per year has been laundered and involved in PEP fraud and just ill-gotten gains, stolen assets, and basically bribery, corruption, insider trading across the 12 poorest countries in the world. So again, this is something that at the World Bank level, never mind our North American regulators, at a World Bank level, they've highlighted as an issue. And what's happened there is organizations have started to build this question into their internal audit. They've started to see it come down from the auditors, and then internally they're starting to try and document it. Part of what we're trying to do in WorldCheck, part of where we're strong, of course, is actually benchmarking off of the global regulatory indexes to make sure that we're focused on what the regulation is. As those regulations change, we need to, of course, make those changes. I mentioned over the past 10, 20 years, what we've seen is a huge spike. Now, actually, half of the WorldCheck data is PEP content, where in the past it was only a sliver. So more and more and more organizations are setting up transaction monitoring rules about PEP exposure. So if somebody's a PEP or an affiliate of a PEP or an associate of a PEP or maybe used to be a PEP, you can then treat that risk modeling perhaps separately than you would somebody who's not a PEP. Okay, and again, feel free to throw your questions in the organizer panel and we'll address them at the end. Historically, what we've seen from clients, and we're getting this back from market research, is that self-disclosure has been the big sort of way that clients are trying to deal with this. Are you a PEP? Are you, do you have any affiliations with Russian banking and so on, right? You kind of ask these questions about, is your dad, is your mom a mayor? Part of the challenge with that, of course, is self-disclosure. People who are bad guys or have that political affiliation simply aren't going to disclose. But more often than not, simply people don't know. Based on the complexity of the regulation, people don't know that, their son-in-law used to have an affiliation to, an organized sporting agency, and all of a sudden they're a PEP, right? Financial institutions, FinCEN regulated institutions need to take that seriously, need to document it, need to disclose it to their regulators. Okay. couple other comments from a PEP content perspective. What we're seeing is that ultimately organizations are looking not to overcomplicate things, but rather to set up these rules and structures so that they can then simplify it and create that automation. So based on what type of PEP your counterparty is, and we could talk about sanctions and regulatory enforcement and negative news. But again, there's just such a volume of PEPs that clients are dealing with that it's important to kind of place our finger on it. Once we've got that broad net cast, so to speak, then what we want to do is really simplify what we're bringing in terms of content, and understanding how PEPs are subcategorized, how long ago somebody was a PEP, allows you to build that risk-based approach and allows you to create that automation. Andrew spoke about time and remediation and the time that we see clients are managing false positives. And when you're able to set up these rules ahead of the time, what it does is just basically takes workflow out of the equation. What you want to do is spend less time looking at false alerts and less time looking at low risk alerts where possible. Again, enabling that automation. Okay. Outside of the PEP content, oftentimes in the panels, we're getting questions about other areas of risk that organizations are looking to create efficiency on, whether it be sanction screening. Of course, WorldCheck's going to include, your OFACs and your OSFIs, and over to SICO in Switzerland and DBB in Germany, and so on and so forth. Sanctions coverage is total. Your regulatory enforcement, this is a little bit more sort of white collar crime, securities fraud, insider trading, SEC violations or federal trade commissions, maybe Office of Immigration violations, these sorts of things. And of course, law enforcement. This is kind of the CIA, the FBI, down to the negative news associated with predicate offenses. So whether it's the local news, regional news, national news, everything's going to be covered to make sure we've captured all of that exposure. We add that to PEPs, and that again is what makes up WorldCheck. Remember, though, sanctions are relatively easy. There's only going to be about 12 to 15,000 people globally that are actually sanctioned. Remember, sanctions is like, the worst of the worst of the worst, right? This is like war crimes, terror financing, sort of human trafficking, like very, very heinous stuff. Where we're seeing the majority of exposure to the North American institutions are things like cybercrime, hacking, phishing, racketeering, price fixing. It's fraud, it's organized crime. We're seeing a huge connection for organized crime in the Northeast, a huge connection to organized crime, believe it or not, in the Midwest and West Coast, California area states. And again, this is something that gets picked up in the content. So when you take that risk content, right, and then you take that PEP content, what you get is a total picture of where your potential exposure for transaction monitoring and efficiency measures could or should be. And then again, what we do is we break that down. You combine this with your country risk. You would combine this with your transaction nature. You would combine it with things like transaction size, transaction frequency, right? If I'm a casino, for example, maybe I want to treat my, $1 and $2 players, kind of me and my wife, we go to the casino on the weekend, spend a couple $100 and get dinner. You're going to treat that profile person a little bit differently than your high rollers club, what have you. As an MSB, if you've got, a storefront retail operation, you've got people walking in off the street, maybe you want to treat those a little bit differently than, your frequent flyers miles, so your frequent flyers club, or whoever transacts maybe weekly, monthly, annually. Okay. And again, that's going to be adjusted by institution based on your risk-based approach. And then even within institutions, within banks, what we'll see is like a retail bank will have its own risk-based approach relative to, say, a corporate banking and or securities division and or wealth division. So each of these groups will break down the type of PEPs they're dealing with, break down the type of business lines that they're working with, and then from there set up these rules that would then workflow in the technology so that your people aren't literally sitting in cubicles trying to think about this stuff. Like once the rules are set up, everything just runs, if that makes sense. Okay. From a content perspective, remember we talked about self-disclosure. Like anybody can find, Barack Obama. Anybody can find, high-level PEPs. Like that's easy stuff. When we start to get into Russian sectoral sanctions, we can look at Iranian economic interest data. We can look at global sectoral sanctions. And it's evolving too, right? That's the thing that's challenging for a lot of clients is just with the current geopolitical landscape, these things, may change or pivot from time to time. What we're seeing is that the connections are key. When bad guys are bad guys, as a phrase, or if a PEP's up to no good, right? Let's say you've got, the son of a mayor who's embezzling or investing, public funds. That person knows they're up to no good. So what they do is, as Andrew spoke to, whether it's layering or smurfing, they're creating shell companies. They've got subsidiaries of shell companies, front companies. subsidiaries, upfront companies, it gets to be a very technical and a very difficult, web to unravel. So having those associates, having those affiliates, having those counterparties associated with the crime are first and foremost to having that risk-based approach within your business. Once you have that framework of who these people's associates are, then that can further complement and further complete the picture for your transaction monitoring efforts. Okay. From a content perspective, we talked a lot about what's in there. With that said, there's a lot that's not in there. So we're not looking to report on crime, candidly, that's not predicate. So we work with the regulators, we work with the regulatory bodies to help not only save that time, create automation, help you consolidate those systems, where if I got in a fight with my neighbor and I punched him in the nose, then that's not going to show up in WorldCheck, right? That's not going to show up in your transaction monitoring workflow or your risk profiling workflow. That wouldn't matter to you from an account opening decisioning perspective. Far too many of our clients' systems prior to joining and upgrading technology is clogged with false alerts and false positives. It's basically news that isn't newsworthy, if that makes sense from an AML perspective, right? You guys are making decisions in a financial context framework, so the content that's going in should be just that in a financial context framework. Okay, and of course, that's based on the predicate offenses from groups like FATF and Wolfsburg Group and the UN and the World Bank. And as those change, we of course need to stay on top of them. Okay, moving along, once we've got all of the content, Andrew talked a little bit about enriching the data. We so too then enrich that data using about 11 to 12,000 global media outlets, where we actually take the name and add things like age, date of birth, place of birth, passport information, alternate spelling, nicknames. When you search for John Smith currently in an onboarding workflow, and you start getting false positives from Johnny Smith or Jonathan Smith or a nickname Johnny Boy or what have you, if you can filter those out or consolidate them down into the original profile, what you're getting in your process is less noise. We would then complement that with things like linked to companies, linked to external sources, and then categorize and subcategorize based on crime type as well as other features that then again allow you to set up the rules and the methodology to help create the framework that the technology will run on, if that makes sense. Right? And it's not just for onboarding, right? There's going to be there's an onboarding screening workflow, whether it's transaction monitoring or risk profiling, but it's also that ongoing that we see clients struggle with. So what do I do once I have to once I've onboarded? FinCEN talks about ongoing monitoring, for sanctions and PEPs and risk screening. How do I stay on top of what I need to stay on top of? Is it weekly? Is it monthly? Is it quarterly? And the answer is it's going to depend based on your risk-based approach, based on your as an institution's risk aversions or perhaps risk savviness. Some organizations may only do something at onboarding. Most organizations, I would say, have an ongoing framework of some sort, whether it's quarterly, biannually, or live is typically what we strive for. Organizations in their high risk and for the most part in the FinCEN regulated entities have some sort of live ongoing monitoring. When there's a change in update, when somebody marries a PEP, somebody divorces a PEP becomes deceased, that should feed and filter through the rules that we talked about, through the data that we talked about, and basically decision and action your risk workflows using the technology. Okay. From a content perspective, again, we take all of the information from the global news, look at where's their sanction risk, where's their PEP risk, where is their law enforcement regulatory risk, who are those associates, who are those affiliates, what is their date of birth, what country are they from, right? We take all of this information and then we consolidate and deduplicate the profile. The challenge that clients have is when OSFI releases or OFAC releases a notice, is that SECO picks it up in Switzerland and then DBB in Germany, and sort of the list goes on and on. You get a knock-on effect. So what you get is 10 or 12 or 15 hits where the SEC picks it up, and then the sell-side securities dealers in Asia pick it up, and then France pick it up, and what you just get is a commensurate amount of results. Everything needs to be completely deduplicated and completely consolidated. That way, key data points like gender, citizenship, things that are static to a profile, if those can be captured in the data, captured in your software, and then you use as part of your risk-based approach to set up those rules, it'll help you create that efficiency, which ultimately you're working for. Everything should sort of run in the background, right? We already have, or I would suggest most clients are striving towards having a completed KYC record, right? We're asking clients, where are you from? Where are you born? Date of birth, if not age of birth, right? If you have this information, if we can't compare that to, your risk records, then, when you have to look for a Lee, Mr. First name Lee, last name Lee, or first name, Mohammed, last name Ahmed, it becomes very challenging to remediate those false positives. And what you get is basically a pile of case management work that ultimately you can never end up remediating. So when you can, again, enrich the content with relevant, up-to-date factual information based on the regulations, mirror that against the regulations themselves, and then workflow it in a system, it creates tremendous efficiency gains. And again, maybe it needs to be done on your servers or via an API, or maybe there's a little bit of something homegrown that we're layering something on top of. We can figure out the how. But at its core, I would suggest benchmarking off of global regulations, starting to create policy and framework around what you're collecting and why, and then documenting a risk-based approach within your business for what you're screening, what you're risk profiling, and when. Again, create that efficiency and set up something that's scalable for your practice. I want to pass it back to Andrew just to kind of bring it back and bookmark some of the themes that we've been talking about today.
Okay, great. Thank you, Brett. So we have a few questions coming in already. We'll encourage you guys to put in your questions so that we can, between Brett and myself, we can try to respond. And if we don't have enough time, we'll still try to send you a response separately. Okay, so again, so how do you get this going, right? I think there are a lot of different views about this, but I think that you really need to start asking from the business questions. Most transaction monitoring systems are built on a really strong risk assessment. And in fact, some of the guidelines that are coming out from the regulators are very clear on this, by the way. So one of the things that they would say is that it has to be predicated on a thorough and really well done risk assessment. What are my exposures? What's my business controls? Where are the different risks? How do I mitigate them using transaction monitoring? So from that standpoint, that's where you need to start. That comes in, and after you have completed that risk assessment or the business questions that you need to ask, what you need to start also do is that you also need to understand where the data. What are all the data points that I need? How do I get it? How do I prepare it? How do I bring it in? There are also questions about modeling, meaning modeling is also talking about, okay, so what do I need? Do I need just a few rules? Do I need some sort of AI type technology or machine learning type technology to do some level of clustering, or what do I need? Then you have to look at that and then you evaluate it. How well is it working? In most instances, transaction monitoring systems fail because persons implement them without really evaluating, without really looking at how well is it working. You did the risk assessment, you thought this is an amazing rule, amazing scenario, and then when you implement it, it's like, maybe not that great. So then you have to look at this ongoing process of refining and validating and refreshing the whole process and making it better. After you've deployed it, there's also the matter of how do you sustain it. So the sustainability of your transaction monitoring thing, I believe that honestly, you really should be looking the first year that you implement your transaction monitoring technology, you really should be looking at assessing it like every 3 months in that first year. How well is it working? Where am I getting overrun by alerts? Why am I not getting any alerts on certain areas? Is the remediation process set up properly? Am I getting all the right fields that allow me to make the right decisions? Those things will need refinement as you go along. And beyond that, even after it gets settled, I think you should still go back and assess it and look at and validate in the different models and everything. You should do that, I think, maybe every 6 to 12 months. Okay, so you have to start with asking the right questions, and then you have to also make sure that what you build is actually giving you the value. And one way of doing that, this is an example of looking at transaction monitoring from a filtering standpoint. So this is a chart that just says, hey, I have $30 million of transactions flowing through my system, and in my filtering process, I've stopped $2.4 million. For remediation, for investigations, and it goes through, and then it says, okay, we have only denied X percentage. So it looks at the efficiency of the process. How well is it working? Where am I having spikes? Where am I having unnecessary blocking or stopping of transaction in the business and causing problems? So again, you can't just implement transaction monitoring systems without getting this high-level view and getting the big picture of what you're doing. And you also have to look at how well the data that you've brought in to enrich the process, how well is that working out very well.